Hi gang, remember that time when the Ultramarines had a Half-Eldar Chief Librarian? Illiyan Nastase is one of those old bits of Warhammer lore that's occasionally rolled out as an example of how the setting has changed over time, but it's actually a really good microcosm of how 40k lore works. So, in this video, let's look at this weird little character introduced just a few months after the release of 40k itself, and then shelved until his reintroduction 33 years later. Welcome players to the most niche retrospective video so far. Unlike in previous retrospectives, we're not looking at an entire range, or an entire army, or even an entire galaxy-wide mega plot. No, this time we are looking at the history of one guy. Or maybe two, depending how you frame it. Illiyan Nastase, Ultramarine astropath, half-Eldar, Dark Angel, Librarian turned Eldar, Farseer, and occasional tennis legend. The story of how this character has changed over the years he's been in 40k is a pretty short one. He only really appears 3 times in the whole history of the setting, but looking at him does give us a really good example of how different the early days of Warhammer were, and how the franchise treats the idea of canon and retcons as that changes over the years. So I thought it'd be a fun video. To begin this story, we need to travel back in time, back to the ancient times of 1987, to when the entire universe of 40k was just a few terrible puns in a magazine. For all their importance to the setting, the first edition of Warhammer 40k, Rogue Trader, had about 8 to 10 pages of information about Space Marines. Literally all Space Marines. That was it. At the time, the chapter that got the most information was the Space Wolves, in a very different form to their current incarnation, and there were no codexes around, so any additional information on how Space Marines worked was presented as a series of articles in White Dwarf magazine, occasionally gathered together every few years into a compilation book. The Ultramarines, now the iconic blue poster chapter of Warhammer 40k, were in this original image in the Rogue Trader rulebook, but that was everything about them, just a picture. Any more information would have to wait for 4 months until White Dwarf 97 in January 1988, when they were introduced as part of a new series called Index Astartes, a description of the 13th chapter of the Emperor's Astartes, the Ultra Space Marines. And here is the very first paragraph in that article. Captain Asata made his way up the winding steps to the fortress's upper battlements. He was not surprised to see the elegant form of astropath Illiyan Nastase staring out sightlessly from the edge of the ramparts. The half-human psyker never failed to unnerve him. As he approached, the shrill voice of the bastard pierced the hot evening air. Captain Kiorn Asata, he announced, without turning his head. Your footfalls are as distinctive as an amble dancing on a tile roof. There we go, right at the start. One of the very first named characters in a very different description of the Ultramarines to the one we're used to. The half-human, sounds a bit heretical, astropath Illiyan Nastase in some colour text. This whole article is a sort of profile of the chapter, mostly concerned with its organisation and its command staff, the masters of the chapter, of which Illiyan is one. The tone of the whole thing betrays White Dwarf's origins as a role-playing game magazine. The article might have some in-game stats for squads, but the vast majority of it is taken up with descriptions of the personalities involved, who they like and dislike, who they're friends with and allies with, their backstories, like your PCs are about to go adventuring in the Ultramarines Fortress Monastery. But considering this is the first published record of the chapter, there are a surprising amount of things that have stayed the same over the years. The Ultramarines are noted as taking on chapter number 13, which is their legion number in modern 40k, though in this version they got that number as a reassignment from a traitor chapter after the Heresy War. One of the traitor legions went away and number 13 was spared, so the Ultramarines got the number and their gene seed, which is not how things work now. They're still based on the planet of Macragge, no mention of Ultramar, and Macragge is now a world of dusty deserts with zero moisture, and where the only vegetation is mushrooms and the only fauna crawlers and ambles, apparently imported for experimental reasons. It's a far cry from space Rome. Their chapter master is still Marnius Calgar, and he still fights with 2 power gloves, though in this version he's only the 4th ever chapter master, and he also has 4 bionic limbs after getting them all ripped off fighting the Tyranids. I think that's what these velociraptors next to him are meant to be. His power gloves in this are just very advanced bionic hands. Also, in another similarity, the Ultramarines are still major rivals of the Tyranids. They're listed as taking part in all of the major tyrannic wars. We get a look at their company and squad structure, though this being 1987, the squad names are all a bit more metal. The tactical squads are known as Flayers, and their heavy weapon squads as Crushers, and they have special anti-Tyranid assault squads known as Scalpers, which I guess you could see as a precursor to the Tyrannic War veterans of later editions. Like a lot of Rogue Trader articles, this is a weird mix between very jokey and very detailed. There's a funny insert about their schedule. At 8 PM it's time for prayers and high tea, and then there's way drier sections on the way that their communication staff are organised and the breakdown of their vehicle pool. But eventually, going through it, during a rundown of their senior officers, we get more information on our elusive astropath. Chief Librarian, astropath Illiyan Nastase. Illiyan was born to a human mother on the world of Badab following the expulsion of the tyrant there in 912 of the current millennium. His father was an unknown Eldar mercenary. The youngster was gene tested at birth in accordance with the law and subsequently taken into Imperial custody. He was reared in the government compound by the Imperial mission, which took over the running of Badab after the war. Along with other potential psychics, he undertook the journey to Earth in 924, where further tests led to the eventual soul binding in 925. From that point, Nastase was recruited into the Administratum as an astropath. He attained the ranks of Secundus, Prefect, and eventually rose to hold consulship for 4 years, helping to run the Adeptus Terra's advisory senate to the master of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Following this, he undertook 4 years of service to the fleet, a further 2 years with the Dark Angels Marines, and was appointed as a chief of the Macragge Interstellar Communications Link under the jurisdiction of the Ultramarines in 965. Nastase is now 76 years old, current year 987, but thanks to his parentage, shows few signs of age. So if you ever wanted an example of how different Rogue Trader was, there it is. Just like with the chapter, there are loads of things that are still recognisable, are still how the Imperium is written today, but also quite a few differences. The obvious thing here is that our Illiyan is half-Eldar, which makes him a bit of an outsider apparently. Captain Asata from earlier doesn't like him much. In the Imperium we know that is unthinkable. It's heresy, especially for someone working for a Space Marine chapter, but it's also impossible. The Eldar nowadays are depicted as wholly alien and certainly not biologically compatible with humans. But the world of Rogue Trader was much more heavily based on its predecessor, Warhammer Fantasy, and that game made use of a load more classic fantasy tropes. Half-elves are a pretty common thing in fantasy settings. When this was written, the lore of the Eldar was still only really a sketch. They were presented as unreliable elvish raiders and pirates. There was no Fall or Craft worlds yet, though they would come pretty soon after, and the idea of Drakari was just years away. In Rogue Trader, they were just the elves of the setting. Illiyan being half-Eldar would have been quite rare in 1987. There are, as far as I can tell, no other characters who have that backstory, but it's not completely unthinkable given the time. What is just as weird though is his career. So he'd been born in Badab after the fall of the Tyrant. That's certainly still possible. The Badab sector in modern 40k is under the control of the Star Phantoms chapter, so I guess it might be a bit more difficult to escape. Obviously impossible if you're half Xenos, but let's just put that aside for a second. He's raised in a mission, I guess we'd say Scholar Progenium now, and then he's sent to Terra when his psychic gifts are noticed. That's still possible, though here it's portrayed a bit more like a pilgrimage, whereas nowadays he'd be caged like an animal and subjected to squalor and torture on a black ship the whole time. He's tested and then sent for astropathic training and undergoes the soul binding to become an astropath, which is exactly how it all still works. Astropaths in 40k are subjected to a fraction of the Emperor's power, which makes them blind, but amplifies and focuses their psychic powers towards interstellar communication. After this, he's then posted to work within the Administratum, the imperial bureaucracy, where he goes up in the ranks until he's running a department liaising with the Astra Telepathica, who are the department who originally trained him. And that's also totally believable. That could be a character from the Watchers of the Throne series today. Then it starts to get weird. After achieving high rank, he then goes and works with the fleet, then the Dark Angels, and then joins the Ultramarines, or is posted to the Ultramarines. So, everyone does need astropaths. Astropaths are one of those groups that are going to get sent all over the galaxy, and they're probably one of the few factions of the Imperium that could go and work for different organizations over the course of their career. But the idea that they'd be posted to multiple Space Marine chapters would be very rare nowadays. At this point, the Dark Angels were just another chapter. They weren't yet reimagined as Catholic Space Knights. But even so, in today's 40k, people serving a Space Marine chapter, even in an auxiliary role, would normally be bonded for life, and the chances of ever escaping the Dark Angels after learning some of their secrets is pretty minimal. You get the sense from this career that in this early version of Warhammer, the Imperium is a lot smaller or more manageable. Appropriately, for an article on the Ultramarines, this early Imperium feels a bit more like the Roman Empire. There are remote legions, commanded by all-powerful commanders across the gulf of space, but there's also some central military authority with the power to assign staff to them for different terms of service. The Imperial military here seems to have a career path with opportunities for transfer, rather than being, 1,000 separate, completely independent organizations who all really distrust each other. Illiyan himself holds a number of positions in the chapter that would not be the same today, mostly because he's not actually a Space Marine. That's still normal for an astropath. Astropaths would not be Space Marines, and his in-game stats given here fit with this. They're suitably less impressive than all the big tough Space Marines. He's only got 1 wound and he's toughness 3. But despite that difference, he's not particularly smaller than any of the other illustrations. By this point, the organs and extra surgery undergone by Space Marine initiates have been established, but they were still presented as like muscular, gene-altered humans rather than gigantic transhumans that they became in the later years. Also, he's wearing Space Marine power armor here, which is much more of a tool or a uniform at this time, rather than the sort of ancient relic it would become. He also holds the dual role of Chief Librarian of the chapter, and other bits of this article talk about how the Librarius is mostly just an intelligence gathering center and communication hub for a chapter, rather than this hotbed of esoteric lore it would be today. Nowadays, all Chief Librarians would be full Space Marines. However, he's not the only non-Space Marine to hold a position of power in the chapter in this article. The Master of Ships is described as a navigator who went bankrupt, sold himself into slavery, so more Roman themes there, and was then bought by the Ultramarines and placed in command of their fleet. Our Master of Ships is also called Christo Columbine, because silly pun names was like a regular thing in early 40k. Who can forget Dark Angels Lieutenant Gin and Tonic, or their assigned astropath Rum and Coke from the previous issue of White Dwarf? Illiyan Nastase is actually a reference to the 1970s Romanian tennis player Illiyan Nastase, though there's not really an Easter egg or a sort of in-joke reference there. It looks like Rick Priestley just thought the name sounded cool. Anyway, that's our guy. All the information. The half-Eldar, half-human, all-psyker, former bureaucrat, former Dark Angel, Chief Librarian astropath of the Ultra Space Marines, Illiyan Nastase, in his only appearance in Warhammer 40k for 33 years. After this, the lore of the Ultramarines was barely mentioned until 7 years later in 1995 with the release of Codex Ultramarines for 2nd edition Warhammer 40k. This was basically the generic Space Marine Codex for 2nd edition. The weird chapters would all get their own, and it's here that we see the introduction of a slow progression towards Ultramarines becoming the poster faction. For the few years prior to this, it was probably Blood Angels. But in this book, apart from Marnius Calgar, none of our august masters of the chapter are anywhere to be found. No Chris Columbine, no Illiyan. Instead, we get this imposter, Chief Librarian Tigurius, whoever the hell that is, and over the next editions, newcomers like him and Cato Sicarius, Chaplain Cassius all take the spotlight. Illiyan Nastase, it seems, was no longer the Chief Librarian of the Ultramarines at the end of the 41st millennium, and in the years to come, he'd mostly be seen as an example of how things have changed in 40k. Whenever someone would complain about 40k's lore changing, a very silly thing to complain about in this setting, someone would post this guy. Hey, remember when the Ultramarines had a Half-Eldar Chief Librarian who wasn't even a Space Marine? Now, those unfamiliar with Warhammer might say this is a retcon, but as we all know, there's no such thing as canon in 40k. Everything with a 40k logo on it exists somewhere in the world, and if there's a contradiction, then it's sort of hand-waved away as misinformation or conflicting reports. And there are a few better examples of that than with Illiyan. Old Rogue Trader articles are littered with elements that call into question the veracity of the thing they're talking about. This article is covered in stamps and tags. The description of the Marines' toilet schedule is classified information. The rules for Illiyan's psychic powers are sealed data. And the entire article is prefaced by this. It's actually an in-world document compiled by the scribe Sarpo Lupin working for Historical Revision Unit 87/658. Even from the very start of Warhammer 40k, we're constantly being told that the information we're presented with may or may not actually be true. So the designers can write new information that maybe fits better with the version of 40k they wanted to make in the mid-90s, but that old information isn't just gone. The information in the article might now be suspect, but the article itself still exists in the world. Maybe Sarpo Lupin got the Ultramarines mixed up with one of their successors, or misheard some rumours, or got his dates wrong, and all these guys were in charge of the Ultramarines a millennia before. All of this means that if you still wanted to make these characters, you're not wrong or playing in some alternate timeline, it's just the chaos of 40k. And for the next couple of decades, that was the state of things. Until 2021. In some of the most recent Warhammer 40k novels, we get a sort of counterpart character. At the start of the Indomitus Crusade, Eldrad Ulthran, the Farseer of Ulthwé, dispatches an envoy, another Farseer, to serve as a sort of ambassador to Robute Guilliman, and his name is Illiyan Nastase. The character appears in 2 books. The first is The Gate of Bones by Andy Clark, the second book in the Dawn of Fire series. He's introduced during a war council over the fate of the shrine world of Gethalamor, and the presence of this Xenos advisor, as you can imagine, causes quite a stir. The alien's gear was outlandish, a tall helm with a curved forward-pointed crest, huge eye lenses of deep green reminiscent of an insect or a deep-dwelling fish. It wore a dull gem upon its front as big as Fabian's fist, carried a tall staff topped with a geometric symbol inset with another gem, this one shifting with treacherous light. At its waist was a bizarre gun with a flaring back and a fluted snout, and a slender power sword. Fabian looked on in horror. It carried weapons in front of the son of the Emperor. All his life, he'd been told to loathe the alien. Here was one in front of him, and it was armed. Hatred was his automatic response. In fact, that's the response from all the humans in the room, and Guilliman has to sort of do a strong man, now you alien, don't be deceitful routine in front of everyone to get them to go along with it. But in Gate of Bones, he doesn't do much more than that. He advises the Crusade that the attack on Gethalamor has a strong psychic element, looks really suspicious, and they should probably take it more seriously. The second time we catch up with him is a much bigger appearance. He's in Godblight by Guy Haley, the 3rd book in the Dark Imperium series, published the same year, just a few months later, but which is set a decade later in the timeline, near the end of the Plague Wars fought in Ultramar against the Death Guard. By this point, he's a regular presence at Guilliman's side, and the higher-up staff, who know about him at least, seem a lot more comfortable around him. He helps Guilliman, against his advice, interrogate a demon host, and then later in the the story, he's part of one of the more famous bits of the book, a discussion about the nature of gods and what in Warhammer counts as one. And then later he helps in their psychic plan against Nurgle. He's a sort of psychic advisor, called in for expert advice on the warp that even librarians and Grey Knights wouldn't have, both of whom are noted to be more aggressive in their use of powers. In fact, it's often mentioned how frail and thin he looks, and he serves on the ship despite not really enjoying it. Spending time with your people is hard for one of my sensibilities. The smell for a start, and the food. You're not stupid people, but you're unsophisticated, as like to we Eldari as the orcs are unto you. So I apologise if my manners seem abrupt, but your company is almost unbearable. So in many ways, this Illiyan is a totally new character, but I like how some of the elements of his namesake have been sort of kept around. He's still an important psychic advisor to the Ultramarines, potentially frail compared to all the usual advisors, but still powerful in his own way, and a distrusted outsider compared to everyone else, slightly disdainful of his comrades. Phrase like that is quite surprising how much of the character survived this reforging. When we look back at this original version of the character from 1988 and how that's changed over time, we can spot a few things. On one hand, the designers just decided that some rogue trader lore wasn't something they wanted to be tied down to, so they just changed it. And then, years later, decades later, when they wanted to include a similar character, they thought it'd be a nice reference to name that character in a similar way. And in world, the whole background is so littered with conspiracies and misinformation that you can write off the old fluff not as canon that has been retconned, but as a scribe getting it wrong. This is the same method used for, say, when the squats were reimagined as the Leagues of Votann. All that old squat lore from the 80s, well, that was still all true, but they were just one small part of the Leagues, and squats are just what the Imperials called them. All those articles are still sort of true. The implication is that whoever wrote them didn't have the bigger picture. And that's how you're encouraged to see all of Warhammer lore as like a big pool of suggestions you can take from as you wish. In the 6th edition Imperial Knights Codex, only men could pilot knights, and women were a sort of political machinator behind the scenes, until that was changed in Knights of the Imperium by Graham McNeill later that same year. What's the more interesting way to read that? That the lore was changed and this 6-month-old book is no longer canon? Or that the Night Worlds all work in different ways and the ancient scribe that wrote this was just mistaken? Some people really dislike this approach to the lore. They want to have a clear list of canon and non-canon. I'd suggest that that's often because fandoms attract a certain sort of person who wants to prove they know the most, and lore being very vague makes that more difficult. But for most fans, the constantly shifting and reimagined lore of Warhammer is part of the appeal. Of course, we all know that this is old lore and that it was changed and then changed again. But framing it as a series of misinformed scribes and ancient misunderstood documents is just more fun and way more 40k than just declaring it invalid. This is a franchise with space mushrooms and astropath rum and coke. The fuzzy future history feel of Warhammer 40k is like a big shared joke that the fan base feel they're in on as much as the authors do. And that allows for fun Easter eggs like this. The Half-Eldar, half-Space Marine, half-Farseer, Illiyan Nastase. So there, a little video about just one character, but a pretty good example of how 40k works with its old lore. If you want more examples, there are bigger videos than this on the channel now. How the Horus Heresy started out as one paragraph in a box out, or what the Dark Angels were before they were space monks, but they all share roughly the same scope. Warhammer has changed a lot, but as always, nothing is ever completely removed. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to hear more about the weird world of 40k, there should be another video just popping up there on the right. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can like and subscribe, or there's links below to some affiliate stores or the Patreon, where at various tiers you can get early access to videos, join in with giveaways, or even take part in our Tailor for Gamers series. See ya!